The picture on my slide and quite a few of the other pictures are photos from the 3D virtual world Second Life, and that's me. There's a very popular sales event where people like me spend real money on cute virtual things. And this event called The Arcade happens every 3 months. And when I've gone to this event, which is, I'm at the end of it, I don't know if you're familiar with Seaside Piers, and there's quite a famous one in Brighton. I think they've modelled the venue after that. So at the end of it, after I spent my money, I go to the end of the pier and take a picture of myself looking contemplative and then post it on Flickr. So it's an example of my sense of place and kind of identity and rituals. And also they sell virtual souvenirs. I now buy a souvenir plate and a souvenir mug and put them in my virtual home after I've been to the event. So Second Life, actually, I do bring it in a relevant way in the first half, but it's not coming in when I'm talking about phenomenography and case study. So I'm going to be just giving a few snippets from my past to position myself at the start. I'm going to talk about my disciplinary background and view of the world and give some definitions. And then I'm going to talk about 2 research approaches, phenomenography and case study, and I'll say briefly why I picked on those when I come to that part. And I'm going to be giving examples mostly from the PhD research of my students. So I started as a practitioner. In fact, I started in a very lowly job as a library assistant, putting books on shelves and stamping books, because this was when computers were very limited in their use in libraries. But I got a job at the National Library in the UK, the British Library, which was actually very exciting because it was at the cutting edge of online technology. We were the first online service to be connected to a digital network in the UK. And I was marketing the service and training people how to use it. And then in 1992, I became an academic. I think at that point, I thought training was similar to education, and I now realize training is different from education. So it was a learning curve on that side. But also, although in fact I had been doing research, I hadn't realized I was doing research, but we did do research in the British Library. For example, we investigated alternative pricing models for our online service and collecting data and using that as market research, so to speak. But I didn't really realize I was doing that, and it was some time before I identified as a researcher. As I put in this quote, I was involved in a collaborative orthoethnographic project with some former PhD students and current PhD students, where we were reflecting on our use of a journal club reading group in the information school, writing a chapter about it. And as I said here, I'm aware of my own journey from being a practitioner and then gradually feeling for quite a long time I was neither a researcher, academic, nor a practitioner, not quite knowing where I was, and now feeling comfortable that I am a researcher, but I still position myself as someone who's been a practitioner. But I think from what people have been saying, there's a number of people in this area who've got that sort of changed identity, which I think does affect how you approach research. And in terms of discipline, I identify with information science now, even though in the UK I've said it's an X discipline, referring to the Monty Python sketch where you have an X parrot, which means a dead parrot. I was very, very heavily involved in something called the Institute of Information Scientists, which actually started before the American Association for Information Science, but it was merged with the Library Association in the UK in the early 2000s. So I was on their council, I chaired committees, I edited the monthly kind of journal, and was very heavily invested in that in a personal. I made a lot of friends, very good friends through that. And I'm now at the Information School in Sheffield, and that's got a long tradition of information behaviour, which is one of the big fields in information science. So I do feel comfortable in that kind of setting. And I'm going to be explaining shortly what I think information is, because information, kind of centering around information, is what I'm interested in. And it is something different from media, although there's an overlap, and so I think it's worth exploring that. And information behaviour is the name that's been given for a field that's been around for over 50 years, but it isn't behaviourist. I mean, there is positivist research that's carried out in that field, particularly to begin with. It was more heavily positivist, but now there's actually, I would say, more interest in various types of qualitative, highly qualitative research, mixed methods and so forth. So some people see the word behaviour and then think it must be a bad, positivist kind of area, but it isn't. And then information literacy, which, as has already been said, I and Bill Johnston, who I do a lot of work with, we've been arguing for information literacy as being a discipline in its own right. And it must be said, this is partly rhetorical as a pushback against some people who are practicing information literacy and engaging with others to develop information literacy, but reject it as a thing, as a subject by itself. They say that it must always be seen in conjunction with something else, some other subject discipline, which I don't agree with, because people are having PhDs. It's my area of expertise. I think it is a thing. And so we try and put that case, I suppose, a certain amount of evangelical zeal in that, but certainly you can chart through things like looking at PhDs, publication over time, and so forth and so on. But it has been an area that's been developing with an increasing basis of research and international dialogue and things like that. I thought I'd also say something about disciplines, because I'm interested in disciplinarity and what is a discipline. And in the UK there was a very influential book about disciplinarity called Academic Tribes and Territories, by, the first edition was Becker and then Becker and Trowler, and that was in particular putting or popularising almost the idea of hard and soft disciplines and pure and applied disciplines, and talking about the ways in which academics kind of clung together like tribes. Now the word tribe is more problematic than it used to be, and also the solidity of the discipline is being questioned, and people are being encouraged to do more interdisciplinary research and to get out of disciplinary silos. But Trowler, who was the second author on this book, kind of well-known book about disciplinarity, and other colleagues got together to do a volume in 2014, which is trying to look at the discipline in the modern higher education context, what it actually means, and facing things like marketisation of higher education, which we have certainly in the UK, and other managerialism and other kind of social economic pressures which are affecting disciplines and making them weaker in some ways, defensive in others, and so forth. But anyway, they also put forward this new this definition of a discipline, what it means. And again, I thought I'd bring it in because I feel that there are people here from different disciplinary backgrounds, and always when you're looking at someone else's discipline, it looks more homogenous than it actually is, I know. And so I think it's useful, I mean, well, I'm interested anyway in looking at other people's backgrounds, because in terms of true interdisciplinarity, what you try and do is understand other people's backgrounds and theories. You don't just kind of get together and say, you do this bit, I'll do that bit, then it's interdisciplinary. So they define a discipline as reservoirs of knowledge resources shaping regularized behavioral practices, sets of discourses, ways of thinking, procedures, emotional responses, and motivations. So I like the fact that they're acknowledging that it's not just about kind of recorded knowledge, but it's also about very much about practice, and that people get emotional about their discipline. These provide structured dispositions for disciplinary practitioners who reshape them into different practice clusters, into localized repertoires, which is acknowledging that even in the same discipline, people in two universities, or even actually sometimes within the same university, might have a slightly different set of values and practices. While alternative recurrent practices may be in competition with a single discipline, there is a common background knowledge about key figures, conflicts and achievements. Disciplines take organisational form, have internal hierarchies and bestow power differentially, conferring advantage and disadvantage, which acknowledges kind of some of the university hierarchies and things like that. I thought I'd go on from what I'd just been saying about there being divergence, and that comes up in that definition, that even in the field that I'm most familiar with, I thought I'd take John Potter's metaphor, which I liked, of invisible cities, with people being in the same city, but they're choosing not to look at each other, or they're not following the same streets. So I made a very amateurish map there, where I've indicated that even within information literacy, I would say there's different strands. In particular, there's different national strands. The North American strand, because academic librarians in North America want tenure. Tenure isn't a thing in the UK, but in North America they have to publish in order to get tenure, and there's a lot of them, and so that tends to dominate the literature. And tends to be more practice focused, although there are people doing research and theory as well in that field, but it's a slightly different view. So there's not just information literacy A and B, but there's C, D, E and F and so forth. And information behaviour, even with researchers who are doing really good, interesting research in information literacy, some of them have chosen not really to engage so much with the information behaviour field, whereas I think they're very much interlinked, or they should be interlinked, but people often don't interlink them. And so the fact that one's pink and one's blue has no significance. It was just pens I had in my and that's meant to be a river and fish, and there's a cat, and so it's like with some disciplines you find the trees and then someone else finds the river. In terms of my view of the world, I would say I've kind of, probably because phenomenography was the first research approach where I actually felt I got into it and started to understand it more, I've certainly been influenced by that, but it does feel comfortable with me at the moment. So the non-dualist approach that Martin, who's kind of the founder of phenomenography, talks about, in his version, the idea is that you're connected to the world because you experience the world. And so we exist as part of the world, and phenomena in the world, relating it through our conceptions and experience of the world. So he's talking about research subjects being located neither in the subject nor in the world, being neither psychological nor physical, being neither mind nor matter. Experiences comprise an internal relationship between the subject and the world, and that is their fundamental characteristic. Experience is of its essence non-dualistic. Now, I think you could have a kind of discuss after that, because there might well be people here who would want to trouble that assertion. But I think, for me, it kind of hangs together at the moment. And to give an example, so I'll talk later. In phenomenography, you're always looking at variations of experience or conception. So in this context, what I was looking at there was that in this, the people around the table will be having their experience of the world, but there's stuff in the world. There's people, and there's people's experiences and feelings and memories, but also there are things. And although most things, I think, currently in that area are man-made, Some of them were originally trees or bits of stone in the ground. So there are things in the world. It's not just to do with society. And depending on where you are, those kind of things in the world might be different or more important. So that's where going back to that. It's kind of, as I said, for me, I think it has that balance of acknowledges that kind of this stuff, but also that the world for you is changed by who you are and who the people around you are and so forth. And that's how I interpret it. It's not necessarily 100% Marton, but that's my interpretation of it. Also, because of my interest in the digital world, and again, that's me dressed up as kind of angel with fireflies in the wood near one of my virtual homes. So I'm only starting to read things about post-humanism. And there's an author, an ethnographer, Tom Burlsdorf, who did a very interesting ethnography, or he is an ethnographer of Second Life, some years ago now. And he argues with calling it post-human because he feels that virtual worlds like Second Life are very, very human. But I like this quotation from Sean Bain in a recent publication where she was very helpfully bringing together major strands in post-humanism. And she says, to simplify, post-human involves us in making an ontological shift from understanding the human as an individuated separate entity, separate from and observant of the world and its human and non-human inhabitants, to one which is inextricably connected to the world and only conceivable as emergent with and through it. So again, there's a connection with the world. And as I said, that's something I'm looking at the moment and trying to decide how I feel about that. I mean, some of the post-humanists, I think, go further in saying there's no separation. You can't tell sometimes where the human starts and kind of the network begins. And again, I think some of you will know more about post-humanism than I do. But I think there are possibly some connections there. Just looking at the time. As I said, I did want to talk about what I felt information was. And at the moment, I'm kind of playing with the categorization produced by an information scientist called Marcia Bates, who's been writing about this for quite some time. And there's a huge literature discussing what is information that goes back some time, as you might imagine, in a discipline called information science. And again, it's sort of sometimes connected to the debates about what is information going on in philosophy and other disciplines, but not always. So she here has, in some ways, a broad definition of information, that it's the pattern of organisation of matter and energy, but she puts the emphasis on pattern of organisation. That obviously there is very little that isn't matter and energy, but it's focusing on patterns of organisation, so something forming some kind of pattern. And she identifies a spectrum from genetic information that, for example, might be the information that is almost embedded in a bird that realises it. Well, we have peregrine falcons nesting on the campus at Sheffield University, and there's webcams, so you can see the birds coming in with the dead pigeon and cutting it up into bits and feeding it to their chicks. So obviously there's a genetic mechanism coming in there about knowing that you need to mash up the pigeon before you feed it to these hungry chicks. Then experienced information, which includes memories, enacted information, the pattern of organisation of actions of an animal and animals include human beings, and interacting with its environment. And so that's things that one might do, but without leaving some sort of record anywhere. And expressed information, which is part of that, but is obviously important enough. She says she feels she needs to separate it out which includes gestures, sense, language, the ways that people communicate with each other, but without leaving what she calls any durable record of that. And then it comes into the information stored externally to the body, and embedded information. And again, I think it was John Potter who showed a picture of a piece of stone in a cathedral with something carved into it. Yes. And so it's all the sorts of ways in which animals and humans make marks on their environment which have meaning. And obviously, for example, this room is filled with that kind of meaning. And then recorded information, which is like more of the traditional kind of information that is thought of in librarianship and information science, documents, the web, people having expressed the information and put it into some sort of form. And durable medium just means it's there at least for a moment. It's potentially durable. So one might say Snapchat in some ways is not durable, but someone earlier on was also saying how Snapchat could be kind of saved as a record. So it's not specifically looking at something that's going to last for 100 years, it's just something which is not immediately washed away. And residue, what's left over when things are destroyed, like a house being burned down, kind of, and the information within it disappearing. So as I got more interested in looking, for example, at a spectrum of how people are using information from their memories and combining it with interactions from their environment and also recorded information, I found this categorization quite interesting. And just to use again some, go back to this. So again, looking at that picture, the picture actually doesn't capture the information in people's memories and so forth, but there's obviously a lot of the exosomatic information there. There's the providing all sorts of information, the menus. I can't remember if we still had menus at that point, but the cutlery, the arrangements of the chairs and so forth are all containing a lot of information in them that we may or we may not understand depending on our background or our culture. And similarly, on the right in that game, that has a lot of information for me, which I can recall and which I know through experience and interacting with it. And it's a cat game I referred to before. I might just try and bring it up. Screen. Don't know if it's some of them, you might be able to see one of them's moving at the moment. It's squashing. There's not a lot of difference between a screenshot of Neku Atsume, which is the name of the game, and it's just looking at cute cats. But is there anyone in here who plays it? Ah, yes. So you probably know the significance of the thing in gold and the thing in silver, which are the food that the cats bring you, and you can buy food and toys. They're the gifts they bring you, and you convert them into food and toys, and you do it through that menu up there, which you'd probably guess if you could read English, or you might, in fact, even if you couldn't, you might guess that it was something you pressed, but also that I'd know something about the cats and what they like. And so it's another example of an environment in which having background knowledge is bringing you information about it that you could act on if you chose. And I thought I should finish by mentioning information literacy. And just say that this is the definition that Bill Johnston and I developed, in fact, in about 2000. And we've come back to it and wondered whether we should change it. But given that in terms of research, very often if I'm writing an article, I'll be talking about what someone else's conceptions of information literacy are developed through research, say. In some ways, it is a sort of marker saying these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. Also, it's useful if you're claiming to be an expert to actually have a definition that you use that's kind of your definition. And I will just highlight that appropriate there doesn't mean proper, it means appropriate to the circumstances. So sometimes appropriate information behaviour is asking a friend, sometimes it's looking at YouTube, sometimes it's doing a systematic review. So the information literacy is in having enough awareness of what the options are, of what you might want out of it, what your motivation is, how you feel at the time. Having enough awareness of that, you can say, okay, it would be ridiculous to do a kind of detailed search for information. I'm just going to ask my friend here, and perhaps it won't be the best advice, but it's okay. And another circumstance where, no, I need to go to a doctor to ask about this because I want this specialist advice, and knowing when it's appropriate. So that's the meaning of appropriate. It's not someone telling you all the time, yes, that's right to do it like that. It's you internalizing that awareness and being able to use your own judgment. And therefore, the information that you find will kind of match your actual needs, not what someone else thinks you need. And it's also contextualizing it a bit, of being someone in society. So generally, Belle and I have talked this through, and in the end said, okay, actually, this would probably still do, given that it is often serving this function of indicating what kinds of areas we're interested in. So I'm going to go on to talk about two research approaches. And by research approach, I mean something affecting the whole design of the research. And what I'm calling here research approach sometimes gets called research design, sometimes it gets called methodology, and that's just in English. And so I imagine there may be also other terminological variations in other languages too. So phenomenography, because it's somehow a research approach close to my heart. I first felt like a real researcher when I was doing phenomenography, and I've maintained an interest. And also it's I think a nice community, and you've got people in many disciplines doing it, and it has its own conference where these come together every 2 years, and I've been to quite a lot of those. And there is a community that is international and interdisciplinary. I think it's quite unusual from that point of view of having a research approach that people kind of focus around, and that the people who started it, like Ferenc Marton, come along, and they're kind of, there's an Elvis has entered the building moment when Ferenc Marton comes in, but at the same time he's really interested in everyone's research, and so you can actually kind of mix with your gurus. And case study, basically because I think it's a very useful frame sometimes, a way of helping to bound and give a focus to research. It's quite a flexible method, and so I'm just going to... so in phenomenography, usually the main way of collecting data is via interview, although you can collect it in some other ways. People have used focus groups. Although the issue about focus groups for phenomenography is that people may self-censor more than they do in an interview, and getting people not to self-censor what they say is quite important in a phenomenographic interview. But people have used other kind of documentation, such as emails or documents, for phenomenographic analysis. And it's the empirical study of the differing ways in which people experience, perceive, apprehend, understand, conceptualize various phenomena in and aspects of the world around us. And I realized before I started, there may be people here who are already expert in phenomenography, so I apologize, I don't want to sound patronizing. So, has anyone here used phenomenography? Kind of, yeah. But I thought probably most people might not have done so. That's why I'm going through an explanation. And that is Ferenc Marton at the conference a couple of years ago. He's often explaining things, and there he is explaining, I think, the difference between critical aspects and some other concept. And it's one of the things I like about phenomenography is that there's basically one research question. What are the qualitatively different ways in which some population conceive of or experience some other, or some phenomenon? And the phenomenon can be quite a lot of different things. And so it started with their study of, the group study of learners, and which developed in the approaches to learning which gets rather simplified, deep and surface learning, strategic learning. But it's moved on from there and is used in a lot of disciplines, and particularly in the health sector. That's where the largest number of phenomenographic studies still tend to come up. And so you've had studies of the operating theatre, people's conception of the environment. There's a body of studies to do with scientific principles, mathematical principles, economic principles like price, and here solubility. Conceptions of research, there have been a number of studies of that. Conceptions of healthy ageing, conceptions of e-assessment. So there's lots of different studies, including ones in my field. And so you normally choose interviewees purposively to try and maximise variation. You're not looking at causality, and you don't know necessarily in advance what will cause, what sort of factors are important to get a varied sample, but usually you try and cover your bases by looking at obvious issues, which might be, depending on the circumstances, gender or age or length and time in which someone has been doing something or whatever. And in the interview, you're really circling around your key question, which is how does this person that you're interviewing conceive of or experience, and there's slightly different emphasis depending on which you focus on this phenomenon, but you're trying to choose questions which will gradually eke that out of them. So there may be a few main questions, and then circling around the main point and lots of follow-up questions. And obviously the aim is that you bracket or kind of keep to one side your opinions and just sound terribly encouraging all the way through, even if their views obviously disagree from your own. And it's this second order perspective. You're trying to find out what do they think of the phenomenon. So your focus is on their view of the phenomenon, not directly on the phenomenon itself, although depending on the study, some phenomenologists would argue that once you've finished, you actually have got a view of the phenomenon because you're seeing it from all these different angles. And then it's different from some other approaches in that you put all of the transcripts together as one pool. So inevitably you'll be looking at kind of one transcript at a time to begin with, but you're not focusing on the individual, and you're not looking for causal relationships, and you're just focusing on the transcripts. So you might have some other data about the people, but you just focus on what they said, what you got them to say, which is why it's important to have very deep kind of reflective interviews. And out of that, you have to have a descriptive snapshot and a structure of what's going on. So the analysis has to reveal the referential aspect, what's being experienced, usually identified in categories of description, and each one describing one experience or conception, and then the outcome space with dimensions of variation. These are elements which kind of link and separate them, some factor which emerges as important. And what you're looking for is what is in focal awareness, what are people coming back to when they're talking about this thing. And you're looking for elements that they all talk about, but they're seeing it in qualitatively different ways. And the categories have to be distinctive from one another and not just ordinarily, just this category is, I feel really strongly about this, and this category is, I feel quite strongly about it. This should be qualitatively different and linked, and also it should be parsimonious. You don't want to artificially cut down the categories if you see that many categories there, but it's usually not a very good study if there's as many categories as there are individuals. So it's trying to refine it down, which I think is also something that quite appeals to me. It means in the end there's lots of rich stuff that you may be ignoring, because one thing you're not looking at necessarily is what they have in common. You're actually looking for what's different about these. So again, that's the key way it differs. And one person may hold more than one conception, because we may think and feel and conceive differently in different circumstances. So in fact, it's pretty normal for you to discover more than one conception, although it may be that one keeps coming back in one particular person's transcript. And you're not looking, as I said already, at causality. So I'm going to give a few examples, starting in fact with a simple one. I think, well, the analysis is difficult, I think. I think all qualitative analysis is difficult. And at master's level, it often isn't feasible, because you do need someone that can carry out these very thoughtful interviews and then engage intellectually with having just these transcripts in front of them and actually making a lot of meaning out of them. But we have had a few people in the information school who've done phenomenographic studies. This one was actually supervised by my colleague Pam McKinney, and I've used it, because I'll say later on in a moment, we have actually used this in teaching, and people outside the information school, librarians, have said they found it valuable for their reflective practice. And so, in fact, here there are two dimensions of variation. One is your conception of yourself as a teacher, whether you have an identity as a teacher or not. And the other one is whether you feel you practice teaching or not. It's a bit more binary than you'd normally have in a phenomenographic study, but it ended up with these four categories. And Emily just interviewed 6 academic librarians, but between them they held these 4 conceptions. And some of these might have come out in different circumstances. So they said already, it isn't that you could put the 6 librarians necessarily in, 2 in this box, 2 in this box, or whatever. And so actually it's there on the screen, so perhaps I won't bother reading it out. But we have found this has resonated with librarians. So I would not claim that phenomenography is generalizable, but some phenomeноgraphers do. And the way in which you might test that out is actually just engaging with people in similar groups and finding whether the categories resonate with them, whether they can discuss them, reflect on them, and so forth. The next one is from Joseph Essel's research. He was looking at the qualitatively different ways in which trainee teachers in Ghana conceive of the information literate teacher. And his site was the University of Education, Winneba, which is just devoted to teacher training. And he was looking at it has more than one site, but for pragmatic reasons, he was looking at the biggest site. And he interviewed 25 second year students in Ghana, who were purposively varied. Although, again, as with much research, he had to be pragmatic about who he had access to, but he did work hard to get some variety. And a number of these had been teaching already and then had come in to do their teacher training. So I'm going to present the categories for this, that sometimes in phenomenography there is a hierarchy, an inclusive hierarchy, and in fact he discovered that there was. So it should really, I suppose, in a way be the other way up, because the kind of basic was linguistic competence. It was really important to know English. It was felt you couldn't really access information with English, and also it was very much to do with professional identity because of the colonial heritage, and English is the prestige language. There are many local languages, and so you're not seen as being a credible professional unless you were very competent in English. And so that came through as a kind of baseline thing, and it allowed you into the electronic world of information. And so the next one was being competent in actually using ICT and information retrieval. Then on top of that, another category was the critical awareness about the quality of the sources, being able to discern between sources and the relevance of sources. Then knowledge building for yourself and also for your students, being able to use the information that you'd acquired and turn that into knowledge which could be used in teaching or used for your own purposes. And finally, professional growth, using information to become a competent professional, to function as a professional in Ghana as an information literate teacher. So, as I said, those are the categories that emerged for him. And I'm just going to finish this by mentioning Shahad Salha's research. She gathered her data before the civil war in Syria. She graduated, she was about to go back to Damascus University, and she is an activist. She was an activist right from the start, so she hasn't been able to go back to Syria with her family. But at that point in Syria, there was a law that if a teacher became ill, they became a librarian. So school librarians consisted of people who'd actually trained to be and wanted to be school librarians, and teachers who'd been told they had to become librarians because there was some problem, quite often to do with health. So that wasn't an ideal situation, and she wanted to investigate their information literacy. And so she was looking at the varying ways in which they conceive of information literacy. And also she introduced an element of action research because she had a first phase where she interviewed them phenomeноgraphically. And I haven't got time to go into that, but there were issues that were brought up, I think, yesterday, that, for example, she couldn't be alone with a male unless there was, say, the wife there. In one case, a participant adopted her as his daughter so that they could be in the same room together. And so there were some very interesting cultural issues. And she interviewed in Arabic. And so she took, again, a very purposive sample, and she had a training course in which she was presenting various ways of looking at information literacy and encouraging them to reflect on their practice. So it wasn't a very transmissive training course. And then she left them in their schools for where they're already working, and went back to interview them again to see. And there were different conceptions, and I'm just going to mention the second lot that she came up with. And I haven't got time to read through them all, but it was interesting because there have been very few studies in, I think this was the first study in the Arabic context of people's conceptions of information literacy. And there were, just as with Joseph's, the English language thing came out strongly, which does not come out evidently in studies which look at native English speakers. Here there was a spiritual aspect that was very important, and transformative aspect. So it was rather different to the sets of conceptions that had come out of Western studies. So, for example, information literacy as illumination, paving the way to achieve better practice. It illuminates people's abilities to make the right decisions, enhances people's self-confidence, and widens the horizons for unlimited possibilities. And there's some really lovely, I think they're lovely. There's some beautiful quotations to do with that particular aspect, but also ones who are positioning information for them. They decided what information literacy was, and it was positioned a particular way, like the one that is for the elite. It's for people who can actually do this. It's not for everybody. And putting emphasis on different aspects. And so there were actually a wider range of conceptions that emerged from the second interviews, and some overlap, but definitely people developing more their own emphases about what information literacy actually meant to them as librarians. So I would say you can't have something that just has a phenomenographic texture, whereas I think you can have an ethnographic texture, and you can sort of use a grounded approach, and it's not grounded theory, but you can say, well, I'm using a grounded approach to my data. But I don't think something can be a bit phenomenographic. But you can combine it. There, Shahad was using this element of action research. She didn't do any analysis as action research, but she was introducing that as an element. And also, depending on your sample, if they were all had some communality where you could put them within a context, you might be able to gather some other data which would enable you to have a second approach, and then perhaps combine the insights from the phenomenography and this other approach, such as ethnography. And in terms of applications, Ferenc Marton's actually got more interested in variation theory, which is using phenomenography in teaching, that you identify what are the conceptions that people have of something, particularly learners in the classroom, and then you use that understanding of their conceptions to design the learning so that they can relate to it and they can see the different ways in which you can conceive of the subject and have a much more in-depth understanding of it. And I mentioned that medicine, it is used quite a lot because it's something that's seen to help people understand the situation, a team working together in the operating theatre, realising they're not all viewing it in the same way, and so forth. So finally, going to case study, which I'll have to zip through because, as I said at the start, I realised talking about two approaches is probably one too many. So case study, I've put here a definition from Thomas, who my students have said they found the most useful. There's a textbook, and but he's also examined it in depth. But he does write a very approachable textbook. Case studies, analyses of persons, events, decisions, periods, projects, policies, institutions, or other systems that are studied holistically by one or more methods. The case that is the subject of the inquiry will be an instance of a class of phenomena that provides an analytical frame, an object within which the study is conducted, in which the case illuminates and explicates. So you're usually investigating in a bounded context. You can tell what's inside the case and which is outside the case. To study holistically, you're usually collecting multiple sources of evidence. You're not just using one form of data collection. There are some studies that do, but it's the minority. Usually you might be doing interviews and questionnaires or documents and interviews or something like that. So that you get different perspectives on the problem. And also you would expect some holistic insights, which is one of the things that kind of makes it a case study, that you're collecting the data, but then you are trying to gather it together to step back and then look at the case as a whole. And different scholars in this field have had different epistemological positions, so in some ways you could also pick the scholar that happens to fit your epistemological standpoint and the approach that you want to take to your research. And I'd say one thing is it's a rather abused term, because it is used a lot in the literature in a very casual kind of way, just to mean an example or an anecdote. Specifically in medicine, there is the medical case, which isn't quite the same as a case study, but it does get called sometimes a case study. There are, at the moment, Jess Elmore and I are looking quite closely at the literature about case study in our discipline, and there is some sloppy practice. For example, the word case study being used to describe it in the title, and then it doesn't say anything about it in the article, or it mentions that it's a case study in the methodology, but it's not clear exactly how or why. So it is a bit problematic from that point of view. So I'm just going to mention a few studies done by my PhD students. Fusadi was looking at the information literacy of academic students and librarians in the Faculty of Arts at Silpakorn University in Thailand, where she teaches. She teaches in the Library and Information Department. And she was also looking at what the existing state of information literacy education was. And so going back to the definition, the system in this case was the Faculty of Arts. That was the kind of context. And the object she was investigating was information literacy. And she was trying to find out what their needs were. So she didn't want to be constrained by that. But she did use the American framework at that time, the ACRL framework, for a starting point to say this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And it was an embedded case study with 4 units of analysis, 4 purposefully selected departments. She used another department as well for her pilot study. And the librarians are not embedded in teaching in Silpakorn University, and so she looked at those separately, and then she did an analysis case by case to see what was going on in terms of the students, what did the lecturers feel, looking at all the evidence, what kind of education was going on there, looking at documents as well. Also the documents about the philosophy of the university, which I haven't got time to go into, but that was influential too. And she came up with a specific definition and also a list of attributes that actually there was quite a lot of agreement between the students and the lecturers about what information literacy ought to be and what they needed. And it was to do with attitudes, research skills, generic skills, and again, English came up as an important aspect, even in Thai studies. I think she said that they'd said that there was more about the Thai culture written in English than there was written in Thai. I mean, there was kind of commentary. So it was important to understand that even in Thai studies, and general knowledge as well as specialist knowledge. And some of these tie back to the Thai culture and specifically the goals, explicit goals and vision of the university. And I just said a word about attitudes, that this included attitude towards obtaining information, which was enthusiastic, you were keeping in touch, current awareness, being observant and curious, having a reading attitude, determination and being open-minded. And this included interacting with a wide range of people and seeing information as coming from all types of people, kind of not being snobbish about it. And also that you were well-versed, so it's the idea of an underlying general education came into it as well. And I'll just highlight from this, I like the one, for example, I have to submit coursework. I have to be enthusiastic in searching for information, learning and doing it. Otherwise, I won't have any work to submit. So I think that's kind of pragmatic. But other ones about needing to pay attention and be observant. And the one about you learn how to use, like, if you want to know about this, you'll try every way to get the information. But this enthusiasm kind of and these attitudes came through quite strongly, which is why I've just spent a little time on those. So Fusadi was using case study, so to speak, on its own, but there was the framework of information literacy with a body of research literature behind it. But Malcolm Tite has recently published a book. He's does a lot of very scholarly work in higher education. And I wouldn't say his is the best book for learning how to do case study, but he's really, really good at critiquing the literature. Has a very critical focus. He's very good at looking at the literature, bringing it together, and pointing out what's problematic with it. So I think his book's very useful from that point of view. And he has a chapter looking at specifically at combining case study with other methods, theories, or epistemologies, and where he devotes a few pages to kind of tracing examples of these different kinds of combinations. And so he gives examples of combining it with action research, critical realism, content analysis, grounded theory, evaluation. And some of these will be philosophies which are underpinning how you approach the research. Some will be sequential, some will be, like action research, will be methods you're kind of trying to fit together into the same sequence. And so I thought my last couple of slides I'd mention Saida's research. She was investigating information literacy in primary schools in Lahore, Pakistan, where I think a majority leave school after the primary level, which is why she wanted to focus on primary schools. And so the system was primary schools, the object was information literacy and its relation to the Pakistani school curriculum and relevant information literacy frameworks. And she was exploring classroom practices in selected schools. In Lahore, she teaches at the University of the Punjab, so Lahore is where she's based, and her children go to school there. Sikh teachers' teaching methodology, whether they're teaching information literacy, and she interacted with the very young children to find out something about their information literacy. And the data she collected was interviews with teachers, observation where she was allowed. So sometimes there was one where they just wouldn't let her see the library. They talked about the library, but they wouldn't let her see it. Another time where they wouldn't let her interview the teacher. Sometimes they said they would, and there were 2 occasions where they said they'd do something and then she went along. But so it was very much improvisation, and sometimes holding a focus group in a corridor with the young children, because schools in Pakistan have many unregistered schools, and in the majority of schools, the physical conditions were not great. And so she had to very much improvise. And there are different kinds of schools, ranging in her sample from an elite private school through to public schools and unregistered schools, some of which are high quality and some of which aren't. And so she was also using material which she asked the pupils, she stimulated them, and that's described in her thesis. And curriculum documents, and she did do an analysis of key elements in the Pakistani curriculum using a particular framework for information literacy that was developed through research and is used in schools in the UK and Australia to some extent. But she then combined that with situational analysis, and it was only when she was certainly more than halfway through her analysis of the case studies that it became obvious that the material that she'd got together for her chapter about the education system, where she had to work to actually pull information together because it wasn't there already, and she'd done the analysis of the curriculum, that doing situational analysis was going to allow her to actually put the case studies in the socio-cultural context in a kind of deeper way. So one of the things that you try and identify is sites of silence, things that haven't come up. So, for example, fathers had not been mentioned when the children and the teachers were talking about the children getting support at home. They mentioned siblings, they mentioned mothers and aunts, but they didn't mention fathers, so they were obviously not getting involved in that kind of activity. And finally, I thought I'd just mention that 2 other of my students who combined methods were Jess Elmore, who's just graduated, and she was using case study informed by practice theory, and also a theoretical concept called information grounds. And these together were enabling her to have a kind of epistemological, the practice theory is also tied in with a epistemological position and her ontological position. The information grounds can be used as a process to examine a particular physical location and what's going on there in information terms. So they were actually serving different functions and kind of fitted together. And she was looking at immigrants who were undertaking English language classes, in one case the basic class. And Avi hasn't graduated yet, she's still working on her case study, and she's a librarian, and she very much wanted to develop her practice as part of this. And so she's still working on the way that we're combining the case study and the action research into a kind of coherent narrative. And so her position in this, because she's been doing teaching to the students, is an interesting one. So those are examples of people combining those, and Avi hasn't graduated yet, but all the others got their PhD, so you know, result at the end of it. But the thing I thought I'd just finish with was that, first of all, in fact, I didn't know what research methods were, and then I thought they were kind of baffling, and now I really think they're exciting, which might be a sad thing, but if you're not excited about research methods already, I think it can be good and really interesting. That's it. Thank you.